Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Williams. I am the Professor of English here at the SDI. Chinese is a sort of a hobby of mine. I'm one of the group that Andreas Guder referred to, people who are interested in Chinese culture. So I'm very happy that this conference can take place here. And I'm very happy that I can stand here and speak English to you as well. That makes a lot of things easier. My short introduction now, as well as the keynote speech which is about to follow, is being interpreted into German and into Chinese. So if you do not have a headset now, you might like to go and grab one. Das, was ich jetzt sage und auch die nachfolgende Rede wird ins Deutsche gedolmetscht. Also wer jetzt Kopfhörer holen möchte, bitte tun Sie das. It's a great pleasure and a great honor that we are able to welcome Michael Byram to Munich. I know it's not his first time in Munich. He's been here a few times before. I don't know how many, but he was here as recently as February, I believe, this year, giving a talk. He's from Durham, which is a lovely part of the world in the northeast of England. He's one of the leading specialists on the whole question of intercultural language teaching and learning. He began teaching in secondary schools. I did too, actually, and I wonder if we left secondary schools for the same reason, moved on to teaching at universities, and he began teaching at Durham in 1980. I think that's about all I need to say. A very interesting point is that his reference work, which is called the Routledge Encyclopedia of Language Teaching and Learning, has been translated into Chinese, which I think is very interesting. He's been to China many times. Maybe he'll say a bit that about himself. And we're looking forward to his presentation, which is about the intercultural speaker. So, Professor Byram, please.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Andrew. Thank you to the university and to the Fachverband for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be in Munich again. As you say, I was here actually I think it was April rather than February. But and Munich is a wonderful place. I'm not quite sure where to begin, so I'll begin immediately with my title. I want to emphasize those three key phrases. Mediation, because SDI is an interpreting and translating institute, and I think mediation is an interesting element of that. The intercultural speaker is a kind of development or connection with the notion of mediation, and I want to emphasize that language teaching is, or at least should be, educational. And in Germany, I can use the word Bildung, I think. I am a language teacher, or I was a language teacher, as Andrew said, in a secondary school, and I taught French and German. And then I did many years of teaching, or training, or educating language teachers for secondary schools in Britain. So, in that sense, perhaps I better give you, first of all, a bit of a view of what I want to do, to look at some concepts like mediation, intercultural competence, and so on. I want to then give an example. I believe in examples as a means of understanding things, and that will then lead to an explanation of a model of intercultural competence, intercultural communicative competence. I'll mention in passing some connections with recent documents, but only as a reference. And I will be very happy to send a copy of my PowerPoint to anybody who wants it, so that they can see the more detailed account of the connections to the Council of Europe work, which I'll come back to. Then another example, which I hope will take us a step further from the intercultural speaker to intercultural citizenship, and then maybe a conclusion. We are language teachers. I am a language teacher. I still think of myself as really basically a French teacher. That was my main language when I was teaching in secondary school. But language is not enough. Here is a simple example. It's the shortest and simplest example I could think of. But it's the kind of thing I've often heard in my university. In a meeting, in a committee, someone will say, I hear what you say, and that's what they're saying. But what they are meaning, what the meaning of I hear what you say is, I'm not interested in what you're saying. Now, if someone who is a British professor, someone who is in that culture of a British university, they know very well that I hear what you say means I'm not interested in what you're saying. If you are, say, a French professor with high language competence, sitting and listening to that same conversation, you might think, as a French professor, or indeed a Chinese professor, I hear what you say means I'm listening. But it doesn't. It means quite the opposite. So in that sense, I think we have to think very carefully about language and what language means. The phrase fluent fool is an interesting one, which comes from a man called Bennett, also used a lot by Fantini. The fluent fool is the one who has fluency, high competence, high language competence, but doesn't understand anything else than the language per se, the language itself, without any kind of intercultural competence. So I want to introduce then these two concepts: intercultural competence and intercultural communicative competence. Intercultural competence would be when two people are talking using the same language, let's say Hochdeutsch. In that situation, what is present, what is salient, what sticks out, what is prominent, is their identity, their group identity. So let me give you an example. If we have a German teacher, I'm thinking of a German secondary school teacher, for example, who is talking to a German lawyer about something that's happened in their school, some event, some illegal event. These two people are speaking Hochdeutsch, standard German, but they will not necessarily understand each other fully, because they come with their two identities: teacher identity, teacher socialization, teacher culture, if you like, and lawyer identity, socialization, and culture. So they need to understand each other's culture, each other's professional culture, their way of thinking as professionals, even though they're speaking the same language. The salient identity, then, is that of a professional identity in this case. That's just a simple example, which I hope you can relate to. Secondly, then, what is that difference between intercultural competence and intercultural communicative competence? Well, it would be the same kind of situation as before, but in this case, we might have a Chinese lawyer talking to a German teacher about an illegal incident. Let's say a German teacher has taken his group of children or young people to China as part of an exchange and so on. That kind of thing is quite common, I think, increasingly. And something happens, some problem arises. And you have then these two identities again, teacher and lawyer, but then you have the additional element that they are using a language. Let's suppose they're speaking Chinese, then for the German person that is a foreign language. Or let's suppose they're speaking German, then for the Chinese lawyer it's a foreign language. Or let's suppose they're using English as a lingua franca, then that makes it even more complex. But it's that additional element of language and everything that brings to the situation which makes the difference between intercultural competence and intercultural communicative competence. So the salient identities here are still the professional identities, but also the national identities. I'm using the word national in a shorthand. It's a complex situation, and I'm simplifying, but to get the basic idea clear. So for me then, intercultural communicative competence is intercultural competence plus language competence as a simple first formula. Then there's the concept of mediation, right? The third concept here. Let's suppose the German lawyer and teacher don't understand each other's way of thinking or speaking, one aspect of their culture. Even if they're speaking in the same language, in my first example, in Germany, in a German school, they might still need someone to help them understand each other. Even from the point of view of the linguistic, the terminology of even a native speaker might have difficulty with some German legal terminology and vice versa. So someone might need to be able to help them between the two, to mediate between the two. And in that sense, even there, you might need an intercultural mediator. If we add the dimension of language to that with the second example, then we all the more might need a mediator, which I think is more than just interpreting. But that's for you to think about. You're the experts on interpreting. But a mediator who has intercultural linguistic or communicative competence to be able to understand and transfer and act as the bridge, to use that phrase from this morning, act as the bridge between the two people. But not a bridge which is static, as it were, but a bridge which is interactive. If you can have an interactive bridge, I'm not sure if that's a good picture, but anyway, an interactive bridge. So this means that the best mediator is not the native speaker, because the native speaker is someone who is on one side of the bridge and understands his or her way of life, culture, way of thinking, but does not necessarily understand the other and cannot cross the bridge. So an intercultural mediator is someone different from from a native speaker. And that's why some years ago now, more than 20 years ago, we invented the word or the phrase intercultural speaker. Not mediator, although that could have been the word. We use speaker to emphasize the contrast between the intercultural speaker and the native speaker. The intercultural speaker as something to aim at, not the native speaker. Because the skills, knowledge, and attitudes which a mediator needs are different from and more than those of the native speaker. And I think, therefore, one can argue that the intercultural speaker is the aim, the model, if you like, rather than the native speaker for language teaching, and indeed for language and culture teaching. So let me give you an example. It's a project from some years ago. It's a project over a few weeks. It's not the way of teaching throughout the year of this Bulgarian teacher of English. But it's a project. And I think projects for a short time have a disproportionate effect. They're very powerful with young people, with children, with learners, or with university students. And the project then was replicated by a Chinese teacher of English. So the project was this. I'm not going to explain in detail. I'm just going to give you the outline of the lessons over 8 or 9 lessons, or maybe more, over a number of weeks. So the aims of this project were that the teacher of English, Casimira, wanted to introduce something to her learners, something about Bulgaria. Notice she's a teacher of English, but she's as interested in her own country and language and culture as in the foreign language and culture. But she wants to use comparison in order to do that, and she wants to make her learners researchers in a way. They can analyze data, they can form concepts, they can draw conclusions. So before the lessons started, she sent them to do some field work. They had to go into their local to the local shop and buy some Christmas cards because it was Christmas. They had to observe and make notes, mental notes, not written notes, because if you might make written notes, people think, oh, what is that person doing in this shop, making written notes about me? But mental notes. And then the first lesson of this project was for the students to talk about what they had seen and done in the local shop when buying Christmas cards. They had to notice who was there, who else was there buying Christmas cards. And then in the first lesson, they talked about what they had bought, and the teacher gave them some simple questions to help them talk about what they'd seen, questions about who they had seen, what age and so on they were, what age, sex, occupation, and simple questions for them to discuss in their small groups. Then they had to discuss or describe what they had bought as their Christmas cards. And again, simple questions. What do they look like? So the language competence here is not very demanding. Until she comes to the third group of questions, the why questions. Why do you buy Christmas cards in Bulgaria every year? Why do they buy Christmas cards? What do they do with them? Who do you send them to? What do you write on them? The answers to this are much more intellectually and, of course, linguistically demanding. But nonetheless, she could begin to get them to think about something that they perhaps had not thought about before. Then the second stage, the second or third or fourth lesson, they began to classify, to take their cards and put them in groups. And there's a process which was in small groups and then the whole class together. So this is a complicated pedagogical process, but the essence is that during this group work and class work that they classify and they begin to objectify and to think about these Christmas cards as pieces of sociological data. So eventually they found 5 types, 5 types of Christmas card. It doesn't matter about the detail. It was the focus upon classification, which is what sociologists and social scientists do with data. The third stage was then to talk about what they found, and among other things they found in the Bulgarian Christmas cards, they found the English phrase, Merry Christmas. That was interesting to them at the time. They found also that some of the cards, when they turned them over and looked more carefully, there was reference to the United Nations Children's Fund. And at the time, they didn't really understand why. But in fact, of course, this is a matter of a small amount of the money that they have paid goes to the charity of the United Nations Children's Fund. Maybe not a charity, but an organization. So those are the things that they began to think about and discuss in class. Then she gave them, in the next stage, the next lesson, or the 4th or 5th or 6th lesson, talks about British cards, and she gave them some of the cards that she had received from her British friends over a number of years. And again, they went through the whole process of discussing in small groups and the whole class together and classifying, doing a comparative analysis of the Bulgarian cards and the British cards, looking at similarities and differences and summarizing and classifying. And they found some differences which were particularly this question that on the British cards there were a lot more reference to, not all of them, but a lot more of the cards had reference to charities in Britain, like for example, the Samaritans and so on. The different charities. The details are not important. They also saw that the British cards, it said on the back, made of recycled paper. And at the time, the Bulgarian students thought this was very strange. I think today they would find it quite normal. But at the time, they found it strange to send something which sounded cheap. Recycled paper? Why not good paper? The value of recycled paper had, at the time, not become a positive value in Bulgaria. So the word value now comes to the fore. And that's an important element of what's going on here. There was more to it, but let me just give you the comments from the teacher. She said the students found it difficult to accept the idea of buying Christmas cards for a charity. At the time, charity in Bulgaria didn't exist because people were ideally equal and had been under communist socialist regime. In the past, there had been a classless society, or at least in principle, a classless society. So the students were beginning to compare the present with the past of their own society and culture. Now, she says, the concept of charity has emerged. The society has practically become, the classless society has practically become non-existent. So these are some of the comments that the teacher made. I want to move on to what one of my students then found when she did the same process, the same example in China, some years later, in the mid-2000s. And Helen did the same thing, and these are comments from Helen, as I call her. Han Wei is her Chinese name. Her comments about the same kind of lessons and projects that she taught. The images of British cards are different from Chinese Christmas cards. To their surprise, and that's a key word, surprise, most of British cards don't contain Santa Claus, Christmas trees, bells, socks, which are mostly printed on Chinese Christmas cards. So she says, you must know. The important notion here is that she's stimulating their curiosity, attitudes of curiosity. She also said, British cards, greetings and wishes for the year are printed in the middle of the cards. Chinese ones are usually printed on the right corner, leaving more space for Chinese to write their best wishes. Because, this is what the students were thinking or talking about, because, they said, China is a land of ceremony and propriety. Reciprocity is essential in relations among Chinese people. Whether this is true or not is for you to decide, but this is the students beginning to think about their own society. And what we've got here then is what I would call skills of interpreting and relating, comparing and contrasting, and through comparing and contrasting, then thinking about our own values and what we do and why we do it. So it's a comparison which is putting things side by side to see difference and to note things which are same and different. It's not saying one is better than the other. It's using juxtaposition, as we say, putting things side by side to see things which otherwise you do not see because they're too familiar. A British Christmas card to a British person is too familiar for them to understand it, and Chinese and Bulgarian and so on. And then the next point that Helen said, the students, she said, didn't understand. They asked me why there are some registered charity number on the cards which don't exist in our Chinese ones. I encourage them to use their imagination, that's the key phrase, and creative thinking by carefully looking at some words printed on them, such as sold in aid of breast cancer care, help the aged, working together with the poor. And this began to throw light on their understanding. So the key phrase here is that they are working things out or discovering for themselves, not being told by the teacher. Finally, she said, a very lively discussion took place about British charities, their role and value in society. And they associated this with the Chinese charity business Hope Project, which I don't know about, but which you may, which aids those who can't afford to go to school. The money is usually donated by some big enterprises, companies, or by some famous film stars or singers, not by selling cards by registered charity. It should be a social behavior, is what the students said. Here is value, then. Here is something which is being discussed about value. Whether it's true or not is not important. It's what they were saying. So at this point, we've got something which I call critical cultural awareness about values. Theirs, the people who speak the foreign language, but also ours. That's just as important as knowing about them, is knowing about ourselves. So let me just emphasize here that what Helen and people were doing was focusing upon developing skills and attitudes. The teachers did not provide the knowledge until later. It came as a lower priority. And it includes knowledge about communication. For example, a moment ago, the Chinese student said, in China, reciprocity is important. But it is also important in other countries as well. Right? So that auto-stereotype, that stereotype about ourselves, is something that needs to be questioned. So knowing about stereotypes, knowing about prejudice, knowing about how people interact, the whole process of interaction, is just as important, if not more important, than knowing things about another country, China, Britain, or whatever. So then, Helen says, after the discussion, then they wanted to know more. So the curiosity had been stimulated. And then there were questions that they asked. How much does a card cost? We want to know more about the architectural culture. We want to know more about what English people write on cards. We want to know more about biblical stories. These were the questions that came up afterwards. And that's the important thing. How they get that knowledge is then a matter for the teacher to decide. She might say, okay, we have the internet, we have all kinds of sources, we have libraries, find out. Or I can give you a quick, some information myself. This then is encapsulated, I hope, in this model. In the middle are in red, are the elements of intercultural competence. Skills of interpreting, attitudes of curiosity, skills of discovery, knowledge about other people, but also about the process of communication, very important. And then this notion of critical cultural awareness, reflection, criticality about us and them. All around it, including then the linguistic in blue, are the linguistic competences. So it's the blue bits which make this intercultural communicative competence, as opposed to the red bits which are intercultural competence. I hope that's now relatively clear. There are many people now who are writing about this. This was work I did 20 years ago or more. I haven't time to make connections in detail, but there is something called the Common European Framework of Reference, which I'm sure you know about. But there's a new companion volume from last year, and which talks a lot more about mediation and about competence, pluricultural competence, they call it. There is, secondly, something you may not so much know about, a reference framework of competences for democratic culture, which originally was called Framework for Intercultural and Democratic Competences. But it was simplified, and the word intercultural disappeared. But in the detail, intercultural competence is very much part of this framework. So both frameworks provide things like this. Descriptors. I'm not going to let you look at that. Descriptors, lots of descriptors for doing assessment. But assessment is a difficult area, another question for another day. But if you want more detail, then it's at the end of my PowerPoint. A lot of detail at the end of my PowerPoint. And if you want to see my PowerPoint, just send me an email and I will send you a PDF version of the PowerPoint. So those were the key notions of mediation, intercultural competence, intercultural communicative competence, and a model which Krasimira and Helen and other people have used as a means of thinking about what are the objectives and aims of my teaching. What do I want the students to be able to do? The phrase, what the students can do, has become a very well-known phrase. The notion of the can-do approach, what they can do at the end of my teaching. At the end of my teaching, they can carry out some research. They can compare. They can discover. They can also recite some knowledge, but that's less important to me than giving them the skills and attitudes which they can use in the future. What I want to move to now is that phrase, in the future. Much of what we do, let me just tell you, I think I've got time for a little story. I was a teacher of French and German in a secondary school many years ago in the south of England. French and German were not and are not the most popular subjects in the curriculum, which makes teaching quite difficult. I remember many students would say, "Why do we have to learn French, sir?" And I would always say, "Do you want the long answer or the short answer?" And the short answer, they always said, "Please give me the short answer." And the shorter answer is, because you have to. Because you have to learn mathematics, because you have to do history, you have to do these. You have to. It's just part of what you have to do at school. The long answer is what I'm trying to give you now, that language teaching is not about those students learning French for when they go to France or sometime in the future when they might use French in their career. Because if you gave them that reason, they would say, "I'm never going to use French." But my real reason was I wanted them to think. Behind the visible surface processes of learning a language, I wanted them to think about themselves. It was only later, I have to admit, that I tried to put this into a more systematic way, and that's why I spent the last 30 years trying to be more systematic about this. But so the notion that it's for the future is something that often is presented to young people. Perhaps it's not the same for Chinese. I don't know how you think about that, but it was certainly how I had to think about French at the time. So, okay, it's future orientated, but let's try to think a bit more about what we can do in the here and now. I want to talk now about intercultural citizenship, combining some of the ideas from intercultural communicative competence and ideas from citizenship education. Combining ICC and citizenship education. Citizenship education is present in all education systems, and I'm thinking, of course, from primary to university. It may not be named as citizenship education, but it's present. In some countries, it is named as citizenship education, or civic education, or politische Bildung in Germany, or another phrase used in Germany by Gerhard Himmelmann is Demokratie lernen. It's present more or less explicitly, but it's always present. And when you look carefully, its purpose, or one of its purposes, is to create good citizens. But that means good national citizens, good British citizens, good German citizens, good Chinese citizens, who know things about their country, its history, and so on. So a good Chinese citizen knows that the shape of China is like a cockerel. A good French citizen knows that the shape of France is like a hexagon. This is primary school citizenship, as it were. But you've got to get into your learners' minds a concept of their country and what it is to be a good citizen of that country. A national citizen. What we're trying to do in this phrase of intercultural citizenship is to move from national to transnational. I'll explain in a moment with an example. Intercultural competence and language teaching, as I said a moment ago, is often thought of as something you will use in the future. But what we do in this project is to use it in the here and now, in our local society or community. The example. This is from a book. I've always worked with teachers, and then I've always tried to persuade teachers to write about what they've done in their classroom. So this is a collection of stories, if you like, from teachers describing their projects. And this is a project written by a group of teachers from Argentina and Denmark. I'm afraid I don't yet have any examples from China, maybe sometime in the future. So let me just again briefly give you an overview of what this project was about. The learners were in Argentina and Denmark. They were learning English. Therefore, a lingua franca, not the native language of either group. They were connected by the internet. This was not an exchange, this was internet connections. The learners are 10 to 12-year-olds. The Argentinians were about 10 or 11, and the Danish students were 11 or 12, slightly older. The purposes or aims of the teachers were rather critical thinking, above all, to make the students think about, explore, reflect upon, in this case, the topic environmental issues. A very ordinary topic, not a difficult topic, not a contentious topic, something which everybody can agree upon as being a good thing. I could give you other examples where the topic was highly contentious and highly political, but I haven't time for everything. So they wanted these young children, young people, to think about globally and locally, to understand things, to recognize them in their own surroundings, and then to challenge. That's an important word, taken for granted representations of the environment. Those were the, if you like, abstractly formulated purposes of the teachers, the teacher group. They also, however, wanted them to act, and this is the citizenship dimension. The first dimension is part of intercultural communicative competence, but the second dimension comes from citizenship, that we want them to do something, to engage. Now, these are 11, 12-year-olds, so their engagement, their political engagement, and I don't hesitate to use the word political, as long as one understands the word political as meaning engagement in society. Their political engagement was to sort things out in the recycling in their school, to look at the practices in their school and criticize them, and then to change them. And then secondly, to begin to look at the practices in the local community and to change them. So the notion of action in the community became a kind of key notion for the teacher group and the students. So there were 4 stages. Again, this is a project over a number of weeks. This is not what they do all the year long, but a project I think has high impact. The first stage is that they do some research, each group separately, on each side of the Atlantic, in Denmark and Argentina. They research about the attitudes to the environment in their own environment, their own context. What's happening in our school? And they introduce the concept of green crimes, that to leave your computer on all night is a green crime. To write something on a piece of paper and then throw it away because I made a mistake is a green crime. That kind of little thing is what they were focusing upon. And then they represented what they'd thought and discovered with photographs, or with drawings rather, and videotapes and so on, and they put them onto the internet for each other to look at. They analysed what people were throwing away in their different environments. So each group is doing this separately and preparing a presentation for the other group. Therefore, that means that they have to think about what the other group may or may not know about us, what stereotypes they might have about us. What do Argentinians know about Denmark? Maybe not a lot, but they might have a stereotype about Scandinavia. That is quite possible. And vice versa. So they have to think about what are the preconceptions or the stereotypes that they have to be aware of when they're doing their presentations. And then the second stage is for each group to present what they found. Now, I say group, in fact, they worked in small groups, and they each of 5 or 6, which each group was paired up with another small group on the other side of the Atlantic. And they discussed their work either in real time, which is difficult because there's, I think, 6 or 7 hours of difference, or they used a wiki, or they used emails. But sometimes I think they also used Skype in real time. They also did some survey work. They did some social science type survey work. This was not difficult because this is something they do not usually in language lessons, but they do it in geography lessons or social studies lessons. So the language teachers could use the skills that the students had from other subjects to get them to do things, carry out a survey of their friends and neighbours about attitudes to the environment and so on. Carry out an analysis of newspapers and look at texts about the environment is something that they were familiar with already from other subjects. But they were using them in the language classroom and preparing something in the foreign language, in English in this case. The third stage was for these groups, these mini groups, to work together to produce something together, which they can use in their own environment. So they had to collaborate now in mixed groups. Argentinian students working on the internet with Danish students or pupils, and they decide to produce some adverts, some documents which will raise awareness of green crimes in our school or in our community, in our local community. So they use the internet, and some of those things links are still available when I looked at them not so long ago. But they use the internet in different ways. That's all, again, easy for them. They know all about the internet. That's not a problem. And then the fourth stage is to, as it were, look again upon ourselves. What now can we do in our environment, having thought about our situations seen from the Argentinian perspective, seen from the other person's perspective, the other group's perspective, to focus again on us and to take some action, to change things in our community, our school, but with a new perspective, with a transnational perspective. So, for example, the Argentinian pupils, they created videos and songs and put them on Facebook about the environment. They got themselves into the local newspaper, so did the Danish students, because this was, of course, an interesting international, transnational project. So they got themselves into the newspaper and explained what they were doing. They devised a banner and put it in the street, and you probably can't see too much of the detail, but it's in Spanish in Argentina, but it's saying that they've been doing this project with the Danish students and they want the community to help them to rethink about what they classify as trash or rubbish and do things differently. So they are doing things in the community. I think I got a little time more. I want just briefly, and this bit will be very quick. I want to point out, of course, that these experiments, they're experiments. They might continue, and in many cases they do continue in the same school and so on, but it's only in those schools or universities that the experiments continue, which is good, but it's not going to expand the ideas across the education system. So policy is important. Policy is a word which many people find difficult or boring, but policy is important. The European policy is in a sense put forward by the Council of Europe in the framework that I mentioned, framework for democratic citizenship. But let me give you an example from Norway, a recent example that I found last year and translated. So here is a policy statement about what language teaching in Norway is about. It is an educational and humanistic subject. I'm only going to read the key words here. But that's the important. There's the word education again. And the word in Norwegian is dannelse, which is a direct translation of Bildung, or a direct equivalent of Bildung. It's a humanistic subject, it's an educational subject, it's about personal work. It's also, of course, about the world of work and study. It also has uses for the future. English is the main language taught, and of course English is going to be useful, unlike French in England. So the use in the future, that works in Norway, unlike Britain, but it's just as important, and for me it's more important, and it's interesting that it's the first thing that's mentioned, that language teaching is educational and humanistic. Secondly, It's about understanding or living into, this is a literal translation of the Norwegian phrase, which I think is an interesting word or phrase. It's living into and valuing other cultures, other ways of life, other ways of thinking, and so on. Thirdly, it's about developing insight into one's own way of life. And that's the emphasis that I've been putting from the beginning of Krasimira. Krasimira was interested in making her students think about Bulgaria. Not about Britain, but also about Britain, but Bulgaria above all. So thinking about their own conditions of life, their own identity, as part of their personal development. Fourthly, and this is in big letters because this is the interesting bit for me, which I have not yet found anywhere else, but it's coming. Good competence in languages will also lay the ground for participation, engagement is the word I used before, in activities which build democracy beyond country borders. So again, that phrase is present, and I think, I'm not saying that this is now happening everywhere in Norway. It's not. And Norwegian teachers will tell you it's not. But it's a policy is a means of creating aspiration, a means of creating ways forward that I hope Norway and other places will go. I must move on. I think I've made the point that then that language teaching and citizenship together can be intercultural citizenship. I'm going to, well, maybe I should give my time a moment just to emphasize this dimension. In universities, my university, your university, I'm sure, we talk a lot about internationalization. I'm not talking about internationalization. I'm talking about internationalism. I think that these students in this previous project, what they were doing here, I won't go back too far now, what they were doing is thinking in an internationalist way. And internationalism is an ism. It is a way of thinking, an ideology, if you like, not using the word ideology as a negative word, but as a descriptive word. It's a set of ideas, which is encapsulated by this quotation from 1960 already, but by an educationist in 1960. Not many people think there's not a lot about internationalism written by historians and so on. There's a lot written about nationalism, but there's not a lot written about internationalism, and there's even less written about internationalism in education. So this quotation, though from 1960, is still valuable. What I mean by internationalism, he says, is a readiness to act on the assumption that mankind, or perhaps today we would say humankind, that mankind as a whole is the proper society to have in mind for matters that cannot with safety or with such good effect be left exclusively within the domain of smaller social groups such as nations, small groups such as China. I know everybody thinks China is big, but let me just shock you for a moment. That's the point. Some of these things are bigger than China or any other nation or nation state. So the emphasis is upon internationalism and upon looking at from a perspective which is bigger than the nationalist, which is bigger than the nationalism that has been so dominant since the early 19th century or even earlier, and beyond the chauvinism, that extreme nationalism which we find from time to time in Europe and elsewhere. I won't name any particular countries at the moment, but where patriotism is the word, but behind the patriotism is hiding the idea of chauvinism, of extreme patriotism, jingoism, as we say also in English. It's a contrast with that, which I think is the educational value of what these teachers were doing. In the projects, in that one, there was evidence, which I can't show you now, but there was evidence that the students were beginning to think of themselves with a different identity, an extra identity. We're not just Danes or Argentinians, we are international Danes or transnational Argentinians. The phrase doesn't exist, but they were beginning to think in different ways to the ways that they had thought about before. There are further examples in the books that we've published, and I always think that examples are important. So if you want to look for further examples, there are the references. Conclusion. I have none. There is no conclusion. But I do have a question. Are we language teachers, to pick up my point from the beginning, or are we language and culture teachers with hyphens? Or are we, as Mike Agar once said, lingua culture teachers? It's a question for you to... I've forgotten the question mark, but the question mark is there. But then there are other questions, many other questions. For example, there are ethical issues. Should I, as a teacher, encourage or sometimes require, thinking of those students in Argentina and Denmark, the teachers said, now you're going to do something, now you're going to go out into the community and do something in your local community. And these are 11 and 12-year-olds. So the teacher is requiring them to take political action. Political with a small p, and political in the sense of being engaged in society. There are ethical questions here which we have to think about. Then there's the question of values. Again, it's a big question which is for another day. But one of the issues which comes up always is, well, if I question or challenge the values that people have in other countries, have I a right to do that? Some people would say no. The relativist point of view is every group has the right, every nation, every family, every social group of any kind, have the right to make their own rules and behaviors. And nobody else has the right to challenge those. Well, that's the relativist point of view. There's also a universalist point of view, that there are universal values. But that, again, is a topic for another day. And then there are specific issues. If you're a teacher of English in the world, then you might find yourself being asked about Brexit, for example. You know about Brexit? You've heard about Brexit? What on earth is going on? Right. Is it? If you're like me, as it were, if I were an English teacher, I would be an English native speaker with an British passport, English identity. Am I a representative of Brexit? Question mark. But what is the way in which I deal with values questions, which are difficult questions? What about if I'm an American teacher of English, and students say to me, but in the United States you kill people, you have capital punishment, at least in some of the states. What a barbaric way of behaving. These are difficult questions which teachers have to deal with. You have Asian values questions. There's been a debate over the time connected with relativism. Are there things which are Asian values which cannot be understood or questioned by anybody else? Are there human rights values and issues? The whole question of Xinjiang, Hong Kong democracy, all of these things are things which will arise if you take on this perspective of intercultural competence and above all citizenship. So it's not an easy thing to do, and you may not wish to do it. That's your right, of course. You might think of yourself as a language teacher, full stop. But if you think of yourself as a language and culture teacher or lingua culture teacher, then these questions will have to be faced. Thank you. I haven't left a lot of time for questions.
I think we do have time for questions, of course.
But I wanted to say, Andrew, that I am going to be here throughout the conference, and some people don't like to ask questions in the big plenary, so if you want to ask me questions afterwards, I'm very happy. But now, if we have a little time.
These are the words of an experienced conference visitor. People are often not willing to ask a question in front of everybody. We do have a microphone, which we will give you if you have a question, so that the interpreters are also able to interpret the question. I'd like to say thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I particularly enjoyed the examples. I remember one of my professors complaining about German idealism, and he said the only example they ever have is the table. Always talking about tables. And so I really think it is important to give examples, and I enjoyed listening to those. But before I rattle on, I believe we have a question over here. So if you have the microphone, please wait for the microphone so that we can interpret the question.
And please speak loudly, clearly and slowly, because I'm not only old but also deaf.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Byram. I'm from University of Vienna, also a PhD student and teacher. I actually have a lot of questions. I only have two points. The first one, in your conclusion that you mentioned that there is no certain answer to, for example, human rights. So we are teaching human rights in a certain region. That how the teacher can assess the learner if they have a progress from this course or this teaching target, because there is no certain answer. And
there's no certain
answer, because we are, for example, we are teaching human rights, and we don't know, we cannot judge if the student's answer is correct or not. Maybe the answer will be very far away from our expectation. And the second part is that during the presentation today, is it possible to develop learners' linguistic and also intercultural content?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Let me take the second question first. One of the things I could have said, but there isn't time to say everything, is that in Europe we talk about a methodology, if you like, or an approach to language teaching, which is called Content and Language Integrated Learning, CLIL. In the United States, they talk about CBI, Content-Based Instruction. And that usually means that you use a foreign language to teach. So, for example, a biology teacher will use English in a German school to teach biology. That is, I think, quite widespread now. Bilinguale Zweig. What is happening here is that the English teachers are using CLIL in the English, or the foreign language teachers are using CLIL in the foreign language classroom. The emphasis in the foreign language classroom is upon content. Not all the time, but during these projects. Of course, there will be moments when the teacher would correct the language of the students, but only in passing, maybe not at all. But one of the teachers involved, Melina Porto, has done research on the work, and she's showed that as much as is possible, and these are not, I think these are curriculum development projects, they're not thorough research projects, but as far as possible, she's demonstrated that the students are also learning and improving their language while they're doing these projects. So it's CLIL in the foreign language classroom. The first question about correct answers about human rights, or indeed anything else, it's not a matter for me of correct answers. It's a matter of argumentation. The students do their research, the students present ideas, the students argue. If they come to conclusions which are different from mine, that doesn't matter. It's the quality of their argumentation, their data, their evidence, and so on. After all, I studied languages a million years ago, and it said I've studied languages. In fact, I studied literatures, and in Cambridge we didn't really do we did a bit of translation, but really we read French and German literature, Goethe, Racine, and so on, and I was tested by writing an essay. And I think I know, afterwards I discovered, that the conclusions I came to in my essays were wrong in the view of the teacher about Racine or about Goethe or whatever. But I still got a good mark in some of them because my argumentation was sound. And that for me is, that's something that's in the education system already, that we need to transfer into this way of thinking.
Hello, Professor Byram. Very nice to meet you again. And thank you again for this another wonderful speech. And I have a big question. So while you are doing education, language education especially, and also this intercultural studies at the same time. So how do you see the intercultural situation right now in Europe between different European countries? How do you see this situation and also the future? Well, you are also cooperating with different Chinese universities and professors,
Yeah.
and you know something about the Chinese, and I think you are also doing these intercultural studies between China and Europe. And the same question is, how do you see the situation right now and in the future, this intercultural relationship between China and Europe?
Well, how long have we got? One could take your many questions at different levels. I think, there are people here who know probably better than me now, because I'm retired and emeritus, but there are an increasing number of master's courses in European universities, or with the phrase intercultural communication in them in some way, some version of intercultural communication. So in that sense, there is a development. Intercultural communication competence and so on in language teaching is still slowly developing, very slowly. In Europe as a whole, what is the future in terms of intercultural communication? That is a political question in a sense, and the thing that I mentioned in passing, the Council of Europe's framework for democratic competences, is a reaction to the breakdown in Europe of good community relations. This is not the time to go into all of that, but the hope is that document, the reference framework of competences for democratic culture, is a means which has been adopted by all the ministries of the 47 countries of the Council of Europe as something that they will use in their curriculum planning over the coming years. And if you go to the website, you will see more information. And in that sense, I'm quite optimistic that some of this work will go through ministries and policy from the top down as well as from the bottom up. So I'm quite optimistic about that, because I think we know what's happening in Europe. There has to be something done, and this is a small contribution, but it is an important contribution through education. Between Europe and China, I think I'll leave that for you to think about. But I hope that this kind of all these things have been said this morning by better people than me about the importance of Chinese in teaching in Chinese in Europe, and indeed languages, German, so on, in China. But I think, let me just say a personal view. China, I've been several times, more than several times, but I've also been to other parts of Asia. And I think it's important. One of the things I cut out of my lecture, because there's not enough time, is to question whether one should also be using Chinese as a lingua franca within Asia, and looking at connections between Asian countries as well as connections between Europe or North America or the West and China. That's an area which I think one might think about, how Chinese can become a lingua franca within Asia, just as Japanese can be. Any language can be a lingua franca. That's not a very good answer, because I don't really know a good answer. But lecturers are supposed to have answers. I don't really have an answer, so I'll stop.
Thank you very much also from my side. What you said at the beginning of your talk encouraged me to make the following months. I think much more than we usually think, we are, even within the borders of our own country, interculturally communicating within our own society.
Yeah.
I'm thinking just about a few areas where this is the case. I'm from northern Germany and I moved to the south, and I found myself in an intercultural situation. I still find myself, although I'm getting better. I'm a language teacher. I'm married to an engineer. And my husband often tells me stories from his company where his area of engineering, the people from his area of engineering do not understand well the people from another area of engineering.
Yeah.
And also there are different strata of society that need intercultural communication skills to live together peacefully.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, that would be another dimension that... In the examples you've given, I suppose you speak the same language as your husband. I hope so. More or less, yeah, okay. Wir aus Flensburg, wir sprechen das anders. Ne? But I wanted to focus here on, language transnationally, as it were. But there are also ways of thinking about what the foreign language can do with respect to speakers of other languages within the same society. So I've worked with some colleagues in Connecticut, University of Connecticut, where the teachers they work with in schools are teaching Spanish. Now, Spanish is not a foreign language, and they don't use the word foreign any longer. They talk about world languages, which also is problematic, but anyway, because Spanish cannot be seen as a foreign language in the United States. But they can use the foreign language classroom, or the Spanish classroom, if you like, to make everyone think a bit harder about the role of Spanish and interaction with Spanish-speaking people in the United States. That's another dimension which the language teacher can also take on. So it would be Turkish in Germany, for example. But yes, thank you. That would be another day, another topic for another day. Thank you.
Good. I'm afraid we should try and keep to the time schedule, which says that we should have finished about 15 minutes ago, but I don't think that matters. So I think a round of applause would be in order for this very interesting kick-off to our conference, and I'm sure Michael has already said he'll be happy to answer your questions during the next few days. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.